Welcome back to Newsmakers. We are with Canterbury District Police Commander Dave Cliff. We'll have a quick look at boy races before we go any further. Road rats, as many of your colleagues describe them. We've got some proposed new tools for the police in the pipeline. Do you think it will make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a very strong interest from the Minister of Police earlier this year when Sergeant Nigel Armstrong was attacked. What we provided to government was a suite of options for dealing with the problem. Now, I guess it would be fair to say that regardless of what laws are passed, we still expect to be some problem. But what these laws allow us to do is really, in a progressive way, start to really get into the problem in a very effective way, and it's all around prevention. So, for example, start with something as simple as the visibility of a registration plate on a vehicle. A vehicle must be visible on the front and the rear. Now, that allows us to follow up when we see an offence being committed or someone to complain. As the law currently stands, it's a fine not to have the plate visible, but there's no other sanction. So what the government have agreed is putting demerit points for the offence of having an obscured or missing plate, or someone putting a false plate on. So that provides a real incentive. People don't want to lose their driver's licences.
Sure. And
then it tracks the way through. So I think it's going to be significant help.
Just a couple of really quick things. I know that you were advocating earlier this year the idea of this cease and desist order.
Yes.
It would appear perhaps to deal with the dynamic of mass assembly mobs, the government are proposing this new offence of cruising. Do you think it will work, the cruising offence?
Looking at the way the laws applied in the United States, which is where the cruising concept came from, It seems to work. It means that if a vehicle is driven around the same point a certain number of times within a given time between certain hours, so it could be, for example, not preempting the way the law could be drafted, that if a vehicle travels down Morehouse Avenue 3 times within an hour between the hours of 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. Friday and Saturday nights, as an example, then it's caught by that legislation. So that's the way in which it's envisaged that it would operate, and it stops the driving around and around in circles, which is part of the problem.
Is the cruising offence designed to address the mass assembly issue, do you think?
Not per se, no. I think the cruising is really around the noise.
Right. So they haven't picked up the cease and desist idea, have they?
No, the antisocial behaviour order, which is what that is based on, which is the Scottish legislation, They haven't. They haven't chosen to go down that track at this point. It's not to say it couldn't be applied later on, but the legislation is very much focused on dealing with repeat offenders who continue to be involved in illegal street racing offences.
Sure. Obviously, the Christchurch Police have been very active in impounding vehicles, hundreds of them, in the last year or two. Obviously, confiscation is not so easy. What confidence do you have that under the new proposed legislation, which of course can lead to crushing, you will be able to get more cars off base one, off impoundment, and confiscated or crushed?
Well, what the law does, the proposed law, it prohibits an offender from selling a vehicle before sentence, and that was the problem that existed under the current legislation. They could simply sell the vehicle or carry out a sham transaction to show it is sold before sentence, so the vehicle couldn't be confiscated. The proposed law plugs that gap. It means the vehicle can't be sold, so it must be confiscated at the time of sentence.
Sure.
So it really plugs the gap for judges.
Crime cameras, are they making a difference?
The number of people who are being apprehended as a result of those cameras is exceedingly good. Just a case very recently where a very serious offence was committed and the offender was identified through closed-circuit television. While apprehension of offenders is important, the greater value of the deterrence is more important. The primary thing we want to do is prevent offending before it happens.
Sure.
It's much better that than having to solve the crime later on.
Tasers, when will they be deployed in Canterbury?
The training begins very early in 2010, and across Canterbury we'll be looking at around 70-odd tasers being fitted into particularly the emergency response vehicles, and staff, again, particularly those involved in emergency response, will be trained initially. So, that's all tracking ahead quite well.
We've had, of course, the William Stewart case big in the news recently, and I don't want to prejudice the case, but there was that sort of folklore dynamic that entered the fray. Does that say something about the wider public's lack of trust and confidence in the police? What did you make of it?
I think it really shows a real naivety and, I guess to some degree, ignorance that someone who has... it's a difficult one to comment on because of the position it's at.
Sure.
But I guess it is always disappointing when people make presumptions about another individual that are based on ill-informed information. They just simply don't know the full story, and we are often stopped from telling the full story because we have to wait for the court process to run its course. So often we can't front foot things for the risk of prejudicing a case, and that is a real frustration for us. By the same token, we're simply bound by the law as it stands.
I've got about 60 seconds left, and reflecting on last year's crime stats, we had, I think, just over 50,000 offences reported in Canterbury. Long term, I know that you are very passionate about crime prevention, and I think you were quoted in the press as saying, you know, this is a 10 to 15 year process.
Yes.
Where is that going to take us, and what's being done?
Well, if you go back to the root of crime, criminals are not born, but they certainly they pick up the habits that will be with them for the rest of their days, really in the period between about 0 and 5 years. The child that is not nurtured, loved by the parents, and getting all the care that probably you and I have had when we were brought up is on a very difficult path. It's really hard to get those skills later. So the most basic parenting skills, if they are in place and wrapped around a dysfunctional family right at the outset with the birth of the child 3 to 5 years, the chances of that individual turning into a psychopath, a sociopath or a criminal are very, very small. Move on a bit later. The child that is then exposed to violence in the home with dad routinely screaming at and bashing mum, that also, the chances of that child turning into a victim or an offender are also huge. So really, the intervention stuff is really what's going to help at the end of the day.
It's a pleasure to have you aboard, Dave, and we'll have you back soon.
Thanks, Mike.
All the very best. Superintendent Dave Cliff, Police in Canterbury. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good week. Good night.